Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be dealing with some really important topics such as climate change and income inequality. My guest is an expert on both these topics. My guest is Chuck Collins, who is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits Inequality.org. His newest book is a novel, Altar to an Erupting Sun, a near-future story of one community facing climate disruption in the critical decade ahead. His 2021 book is titled The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck Collins, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Chuck, let's just for a moment or two talk about the Institute for Policy Studies. What is it and what's its main purpose?
It is a sort of research and policy group founded in 1963. So we've been around for a while, but we really work with social movements that are trying to change things and provide research and tools and policy suggestions. We have a bunch of programs on different topics. I coordinate the program on inequality and the common good.
Mm-hmm. And our viewers can go to www.ips-dc.org to get more information. And what exactly is the Inequality.org operation?
It's another website, but it's part of the Institute for Policy Studies. It's really an attempt to provide data, research, commentary on the impact of inequality. And we send out a weekly newsletter. We're trying not to just be data and bad news. We're trying to kind of lift up the efforts of people who are trying to fix the growing wealth and income gap. So check out inequality.org if you care about those matters.
Yes, most assuredly. It's very important, and it's an issue that's getting more prominent. We're not, you can tell me later if we're making strides in this area, but it seems that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, the middle class gets squeezed to death. So, but that may be a little hyperbole. But anyway, we've got so many things to talk about. Before we get into your book, though, you've had a recent study on the airline industry. And of course, airlines, all planes contribute to climate change with carbon footprint. And airlines, the major airlines like Delta, United, American, El Al, just on across the board, are concerned about this to some degree. But you've got another group with private jet owners or private jet users. What did your recent study on how we subsidize these really rich people to fly around? What were some of the findings that you concluded?
Well, Bill, you're probably not surprised to learn that as wealth concentrates in fewer hands, as we see growing numbers of billionaires and their share of the wealth pie growing, that a lot of those people are buying private jets. They're not just billionaires, but people with probably 50 million or more either buy a jet or they have a fractional interest in ownership of a jet, kind of like a timeshare condominium, except it's a jet.
Yes.
And many people will be like, well, that's okay, that's fine. But what's important to understand is you and I and all taxpayers and other travelers, we basically subsidize the profligate lifestyle and private jet use. Private jets are like 1 out of 6 flights in this country, but they only pay about 2% of the cost of the air traffic system. When you take a commercial flight, you chip in, you see that tax and fees section. That's a big bite. So instead of paying 16-17% their fair share, they're only paying a fraction of that. And the other is, as you allude to, the ecological cost. These private jets burn at least 10 times as much carbon per passenger as even a commercial flyer. So we wanted to draw attention to the excess and dangers of private jet travel.
It is very critical to do that. And what's the problem is because Congress passes legislation that's favorable to these wealthy people. They draft regulations to where the IRS, they don't tax them as much, or what? How many loopholes do they have, or is that where it's coming from, or Are there other
Part of it,
sources?
well, you point to the problem, which is they're a powerful lobby. You know, think about it. The people who sell private jets, make private jets, and lobby on behalf of those owners are representing some of the wealthiest people on the planet. And they have done a good job fending off regulation, making sure their fees are low. They got a tax break under Donald Trump, as part of Donald Trump's tax plan. They accelerate the depreciation of their private jets. So they do a good job. I call it the private jet lobby, which is working on behalf of these private jet oligarchs, basically, to fend off paying their fair share. So it really is that they use their power to protect to essentially create a two-tier travel system. There's one that the rest of us use, and there's one that these high flyers use.
And it's one thing to have the money to do it. If they do, that's fine. But if you're going to do it, you're going to have to pay your fair share and pay the way. And if you're helping to create more of a climate crisis, you're going to have to be involved in helping to deal with that too. And you can make the argument a jetliner with Delta may haul 240 people, whereas some people on a private jet, which is smaller, no doubt about it, and leaves less of a carbon footprint, may haul one person or just a couple of people. So this is just another abuse. And of course, I think the latest statistics I saw, something like 1% of the population own 44% of the world's wealth or something like that. That may have changed, but it's getting worse every day. And especially I think from the middle class standpoint, but just across the board. Well, that's a very important study that you've been doing. Well, let's get into your new book, The Altar to an Erupting Sun. What is it? It's a novel. We should tell everybody it is a novel, but what is the thrust of that? And what message did you want to convey to the public?
Yeah, it's interesting for someone like me who's mostly written kind of maybe boring books about economics, but I had this story that I wanted to tell, and it's really kind of a future story. And a lot of I think one of the things you can do in fiction is you can maybe envision a better future without private jets, without extreme inequality, without the kind of threats to our ecological and human sustainability. So yeah, this book, Altar to an Erupting Sun, it's a story. It's a riveting story. It's about a couple of characters who live in New England who are trying to help turn the corner in terms of the climate crisis. One of them, at the end of her life, is becoming more unhinged, if you will, and she's feeling the stress, and she's facing down a terminal illness. And so she engages in a kind of shocking murder-suicide of an executive of a fossil fuel company. So the book starts with that. And I'm not advocating that people do that, but I am kind of saying, look, this is not that unrealistic, that someone might feel that sense of powerlessness in this moment to make a difference. And if you don't support violent actions, as I don't advocate, what bold action will you take to address this dilemma we're in, especially with a fossil fuel industry that basically is saying, we're not going to stop. We're going to just keep building new fossil fuels infrastructure and extracting more oil and carbon and burning it until you all figure out how to stop us. So it's a fictional depiction of that dilemma that we're all in.
And it's been reported conclusively, really over the decades, that the fossil fuel industry knew what they were producing was detrimental to the climate. They have studies from back in the 50s. Exxon Mobil and others do that, yet they continue to do it because they've got basically $17 trillion in the ground that they want to sell us in coal, oil, gas, those types of things. What can people do to take action? And we're moving towards, I see it with a lot of people, crisis desperation. They're saying, look, the planet, many places you can't live. It's too hot. This planet is burning up. What can we do to get rid of some of this carbon that's in the atmosphere? Because that's causing a large part of it. But what can people do generally. We do not encourage violence, that's for sure. Don't kill
Right.
anybody, don't do any of that. But what can you do within reason? How can you deal with Congress people who are shills for the fossil fuel company? You come right down to many of them, not all of them, but some of them. What can you do to change regulations, that type of thing?
Well, there's really no simple answer to what you're asking, except it would be great if we had a political system that could respond to the crisis that we're in. And part of why we're in the pickle we're in is kind of what you said. The fossil fuel industry has used its wealth and power to block alternatives. If our elected officials, if you and I knew what Shell and Exxon knew even 40 years ago, we would have acted differently, and our elected officials would have acted differently to give us more options in this moment. So the first, and really the point of my novel is, we really should focus attention on this tiny group of powerful people who oversee these fossil fuel companies and hold them accountable. They're, in a sense, like narco traffickers. We should be basically saying, using your power to run out the clock and prevent humanity from putting in place a plan to keep us, on a livable earth, that's a crime against humanity.
This is it. If we lose it, the ball game is over. We have no other alternatives. And people say, well, perhaps we'll have satellite cities on Mars. Well, good luck with that. I don't think I'd put my money in that basket. That's not going to happen anytime soon. We're lucky.
We have no
It's just not
planet
gonna
B.
happen.
We have no
That's
planet
right.
B, as they say.
Yeah, Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the UN, said that quite frequently. There is no planet B. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no cost to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with an expert on a wide range of issues, but two we're focusing on today are climate change and inequality, income inequality. My guest today is Chuck Collins. Chuck is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute of Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. His newest book is a novel, Altar to an Erupting Sun. Chuck, that's a fascinating title. What does that mean? I know what an altar is. I know what an erupting sun is, I guess. But how did you put all that together?
Well, the notion of an altar is kind of a thread throughout the story. And if you think about, in many cultures and many societies, people build altars to honor ancestors and to sort of take strength from those who've gone before us. And in a way, this book is an altar. It's an altar both to real people, and I have people like Oscar Romero, the Bishop of El Salvador, and others who are actually characters in the book or depicted in the book. But it also is an altar to the social movements that have come before us and that will emerge in the coming years. So my view is history is shaped by people coming together and organizing. And I didn't read a lot of stories that kind of have that perspective. I haven't read a lot of fiction that dramatize that. So I like to ask people, who's on your altar? Who are the people who've come before us, that come before you, that could be family members and others? And throughout the book, you'll see or meet different people from around the world who have altars in their homes as a way to draw strength from ancestors.
It sounds like a fascinating novel. And you've really hit the button on how frustrated so many people are getting and the lack of action. Now, there has been movement. I'm not going to say there hadn't, but we're moving way too slow to deal with this climate change crisis. And we see that the demand for fossil fuels is going up, and we're still trying to move to electrical units and electric cars and what have you to conserve energy and on across the board. But it seems like we're going one step forward and two steps backward. How do you view it?
I do see that, and one of the things I find frustrating is how the fossil fuel industry is essentially blocking our ability to make progress. Now they're all out there saying we're green and we're putting a solar panel on top of the drilling platform or whatever. They're kind of, but the reality is they're using their power. Like a month and a half ago, President Biden approved a new drilling project in Alaska, the Willow Project. What we know from the United Nations panel on climate change is we need to stop drilling now. We need to reduce extraction. We certainly shouldn't be building new fossil fuel infrastructure, and we should pivoting to investing in alternatives. And all of that, everybody kind of knows what we need to do, except politically, the fossil fuel industry is using their power to block our transition. So that's the concerning part, and that's partly why the story envisions what is it people are doing at the local level to kind of prepare for climate disruption. How do we make our communities more resilient? So there's a lot about what that looks like on the ground as one region, one community prepares. But then what do we do about this kind of rogue industry that's led by people who know what harms they're causing, and yet they're basically daring all of us to they're betting that you and I are not going to get our act together to stop them from doing what they're doing.
We always try to be nonpartisan on Global Connections Television, but the simple answer, I can only offer simple answers, would be to review members of Congress, politicians, their stands on fossil fuel. If they're in favor of drilling more, then vote them out of office. It's easily, well, I'm not going to say easily done, but anyway, it's one recourse that people have. But I see a lot of frustration out there in the climate area and also in income inequality. And we see that prices continue to go up. The middle class keeps getting squeezed. We see the wealthy get wealthier, especially during COVID problems, COVID outbreaks and things like that. Let's shift over to income inequality. How severe is that problem today? And are we making any headway into dealing with this problem?
Yeah, I would say we the last 15 years, we've seen an acceleration of both income and wealth inequality, and they're slightly different in terms of their impact on people. And during the pandemic, we saw this kind of almost grotesque acceleration of inequality and more wealth funneling up to the very, very top. And we're still sort of analyzing just what's the long-term impact of that. Mm-hmm. The good news, though, Bill, is I feel like there's more of an awakening. There's more of an appetite to address inequality. For the first time, you have members of Congress saying, we should have a targeted tax on billionaires. So really zeroing in on this kind of the harms and the distortions caused by so much of society's wealth being in so few hands. So there's a whole new appetite, I think, for addressing extreme wealth and income inequality, which I think is encouraging. And I think, for instance, our JET report is kind of showing, I think if elected officials went out and said, we're gonna campaign on reining in extreme inequality, what they propose would be very, very popular.
Do we forget history in this country? I know from reading the history back in the 40s and the 50s, as I recall, when President Eisenhower, a moderate Republican, was president, we had a wealth tax for like 95% on super wealthy people. Am I wrong on that? And if I'm right, why don't we have it again?
No, you are right. And in a way, we do forget our history. A century ago, we were living in the first Gilded Age, a period of extreme inequality. And that, I think, contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the sort of pulling apart of society. And really coming out of that, you had Franklin Roosevelt and the the New Deal, but you had a progressive tax system. So absolutely, under President Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, we had one of the most progressive tax systems, both on high incomes and on inheritances and on wealth. And that really did slow that concentration of wealth. I mean, you mentioned 1% holding 44% of all private wealth. You know, at one point, the richest 1% in the 70s, early 70s, had 9 or 10% of the private wealth. So you can see that we've gotten more and more out of balance in the last couple decades.
Exactly. And no one is opposed to people making money, getting wealthy. The problem is they're not paying their fair share. They're not paying their way the way they should, because they benefit from the roads and the schools and the electrical systems and everything in this country. And they need to do that. And that's been one of the problems. I'm glad you mentioned the Gilded Age. I've been hearing more and more of the terms, the robber barons, which we haven't heard for a long time, and vulture capitalism, where there are just no guidelines, no rules. You just rip off what you can, throw people out. Don't worry about them. They have no rights. And we're really into that in many areas of our economy today, are we not?
Yeah, I think, Gretchen Morgenson has an interesting new book about private equity. 40% of emergency rooms in this country are owned by private equity companies. These are investors whose goal is to extract wealth from whatever part of the economy they're moving into. Well, think about that. Emergency rooms, prisons, the food system, pretty much everything we depend on, these corporations, these vulture investors, these oligarchs are moving in to hoover up even a little bit more of the wealth that's there. And that's where the middle class squeeze that you describe is underway, that growing sense of precariousness, because we're all paying the piper in terms of these investors. So we need to protect more sectors of our economy from that kind of predatory investor ownership model.
There's a myth out there I've heard for decades now about how the private sector can always do things better. Well, if you look into it and you see the studies, that's not the case. That in a large number of cases, the private sector is far superior to the public sector, the government operations, no doubt about that. But there are studies right now showing the private prison systems in this country are a disaster. You've got private groups running schools and what have you that have not worked out well. So you need to really look at the studies and see who's producing and who's not. And we're falling into that trap thing. Well, they can always do it better, but that does not, the evidence is not there to prove it. Well, Chuck, we're running out of time as always. I was thinking here as you were talking, I forgot to ask you earlier about the subsidies for the super rich who are buying jets and flying around here and there. To 1 out of every 5 flights or something like that is with a private jet. I was just wondering, did you get any feedback from Elon Musk? I know he was sort of the center of attention on that for quite a while. Have you heard from Elon about that?
Well, so far we're able to tweet information about our report, but he happens to be the most profligate user of private jets. He literally every other day is flying on his private jet, and sometimes they're very short hop flights. I'm going to go from San Jose to Marin County for lunch. So that is a form of excess that we should be concerned about. Fascinating, though, that there are people who have private jets who know they should pay more, and they should pay the real costs of both the carbon pollution and the taxes that it takes to keep the system going. It's no coincidence that Warren Buffett's private jet, he calls it indefensible. It is indefensible. And it says, tax me, make me pay
That's
more.
right.
That's right. It's indefensible.
That's right. He's one of the people. He certainly is. Well, Chuck, in our last 30 seconds or so, what message would you like to leave with our viewers about these issues, problems we're dealing with, and how we can deal with them?
Well, I just want to thank you, because it's so important to have these conversations. They just don't happen enough. They don't happen in the mainstream media enough, where we can really take a look at what we're facing and talk about the various strategies. And I definitely invite your viewers to check out inequality.org. not to learn the data, but to learn what to do and how to plug in. I think there is a growing groundswell. We're not alone, and I actually have some hope that we will come together and turn the corner, not just about extreme inequality, but about this ecological crisis. That's why I wrote a novel that kind of envisions, hopefully, turning the corner. I think we need more visions of what that looks like.
An altar to an erupting sun certainly does that. But Chuck Collins, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.